I think basically you could say, we've seen multiple cases where the main problem has been each of the points on this slide. And so I can't really say where would you start in the general case. Yeah.
So is that to suggest that your world-class organizations have to have at least a certain level of competence in all of these areas?
I think so.
I mean, I guess the question is, do you need to have at least half of these going above average in order to make it, or 10%, or, I mean, earlier on you said you got to really excel in one of the 3 key areas and be sufficient in the other 2, so now we have a set of 7 or 8 here?
Well, that was a little bit of a different spin, and that was more at the total business level, not just inside the software organization. I think in any organization that is actually a world-class organization on a sustained basis, you're going to see not just half of these. I think you're going to see all of them to some degree, and most of them to a high degree. If I go through and look at the companies I've picked out for this talk, I think that we could look at the examples and say, there might be, weaknesses in 1 or 2 areas in any of those companies, but I think you'd see that the rest of them are, they're hitting them pretty hard. So, yeah, I think you'd have a real hard time, if you were only doing well on half of them. I don't see that organization being successful over a sustained period.
So then your consulting clients tend to come from the pool of people that are hitting better than 50% here, or?
No, no, our consulting clients run the full gamut. So, this talk is not about the worst companies we've ever seen. I could give you a separate talk on those, and it might be more recognizable just because, I went to a talk by Watts Humphrey a couple years ago, and he made the comment that he quoted Dostoevsky and said basically all unhappy, what did he say? All happy families are the same, but the unhappy families are all different. And he used that to say unsuccessful software organizations are all different, but the successful ones are all pretty similar. And that's his worldview, because to him, successful ones are all using PSP and TSP and CMM level 5. I actually would say exactly the opposite. In my experience, I wouldn't say exactly the opposite. I would say we see many, many different degrees of ineffectiveness, but they all kind of start to look the same after a while. There are variations on a theme. But really, it's the successful companies, from my experience, that look different because they become so locally adapted. And you start to say, well, like I used to give a talk 10 years ago on, should you be like Microsoft, back when Microsoft was the high-flying company. And the answer was, well, you can't generalize that. Not everybody can hire from the top end of the talent pool. First of all, not every company has a compelling has a compelling offer. Their stock price isn't going up 30% per year, year after year after year. Second of all, the math just doesn't work. Not everybody can hire from the top end of the talent pool. Third, depending on the kind of software you develop, if I'm working on safety critical software, I don't want cowboy programming teams who ultimately produce fantastic stuff but give me very little visibility or confidence along the way. I can't have that in a safety critical environment. So, I think that commonality is highly adapted, highly locally adapted practices that actually make a lot of sense in the context of that company. But if you try to copy them, good luck. When the book Microsoft Secrets came out, I was working pretty closely with a guy named Dave Moore at Microsoft, who was director of development at the time. And he said that Michael Cusimano, the author of Microsoft Secrets, had been surprised at how open Microsoft was about its practices. And Dave had offered hundreds of internal emails and memos and process and standards documents and hours and hours and hours of interviews. And Cusimano had said, well, aren't you worried about people copying you? And Dave's response was, we hope that people copy us because, first of all the stuff we're showing you is from a year ago or 2 years ago or 3 years ago. By the time you finish your book, it's going to be a year from now. By the time they actually read your book and copy it, they're going to be 5 years behind us. Our fantasy is that they copy the stuff that we were doing 5 years ago. And I think that that's pretty common among the companies that do well. Their practices make sense for them, And if somebody else copied them, they wouldn't care because it's not likely that it would actually help. So, anyway, I think we have time for one more question. Yeah. In the last few years, I don't know that I would agree that they're all well thought out. I think this long-standing policy of everything being beta software has been an interesting position for them to occupy. You know, what I think is interesting is Android, because there I don't think you can get away with saying beta quality stuff. People have high expectations about reliability and so on. So as Android becomes more popular and you see people expecting their phone to actually turn on and not drop calls and not you know, that kind of thing. I think it'll be real interesting to see how that plays out. But yeah, I mean, I think I don't think that they're exactly the same company. I think Google is a smart company, and I think has studied Microsoft and tried to learn some of the lessons of Microsoft, and no doubt has learned some of those lessons successfully. But we've talked to enough former Microsoft employees who have gone to work at Google about their experiences at Google. That I think that they also are repeating some of the same, they're following along the same path in some ways that Microsoft did, and so I think time will just have to tell. You know, Microsoft got to be very large, I think, before it stopped looking like a very entrepreneurial company, and I think Google's still small enough that it still looks pretty entrepreneurial. But, you know, when the Justice Department files suit against Google for having a monopoly on the search space and that kind of thing, you know, we'll see how they stand up to that. And you know, when they've been in business for 20 years, I think time will tell. All right, thank you all for being here.